Hey everybody, Mr. Grippa here with the fourth video in the installment on the bones of the skeletal system lab practical. And on this one, we're going to talk about the bones of the skull, and not only the bones, but the sutures, the processes, and all of the openings that you are responsible for on the skull portion of this test. So let's zoom in and start talking about the skull. All right, let's zoom in here on the skull. This is, there's a lot to do on the skull. So first, let's start with the bones. We'll get this one out of the way first. This is the mandible. This is your jawbone. And on the mandible, there are a couple openings right here known as the mental foramen. One of the ways I remind my students how to remember the mental foramen on the mandible is a lot of times when you are being mental and you are thinking about something, you always go like this, And you put your finger and your thumb right on your mental foramen. So there's a way to help you remember that. And then here is your mandibular process where it articulates with the temporal bone on your jaw, on your skull. So let's go to the skull and the bones of the skull, starting here with the face. This bone that your teeth are anchored to is the maxilla. This straight bone in the middle is known as the vomer, and you have those grooves on the inside there as your superior and inferior nasal concha. And then the bridge of the nose, that's going to be the nasal bones. This bone that makes your cheek is the zygomatic bone, and it is going to come over here and be a part of the zygomatic arch. And then this end of the zygomatic arch that attaches here is the temporal bone. So this is the temporal bone, and this piece of the zygomatic arch is the part of the temporal bone as well. But this whole arch that is half zygomatic and half temporal is known as the zygomatic arch. This bone here on the side where your temple is your temporal bone. The forehead bone is the frontal bone. The paired bones on the side are the parietal bones. And then this one at the back of the skull is the occipital bone. All right, and then we go into the eye socket. And right there, where you see that little hole, that is the hole for the lacrimal duct, which is where your eye drains tears into your nasal cavity, goes right through there. So that bone that has that hole is called the lacrimal bone. And then we go back into the eye socket. If you go back and medial, this bone here in the middle is the ethmoid. And if you go back and lateral to here, that is the sphenoid. And then you can see the sphenoid is right here also. So if I were to grab the skull and hold it right through the eye socket like that, I would be holding and pinching the sphenoid bone, okay? Now let's go over some of the sutures. So your sutures, of course, are your immovable joints, and this one that goes across the front is known as the coronal suture. In some texts, you'll see it known as the frontal suture, but we're going to refer to it as the coronal suture. This suture that goes right down the middle is going to be the sagittal suture because it runs in a sagittal plane, dividing the body into right and left sections. And then this suture that separates the occipital bone from the parietal bones is known as the lambdoid suture. And then we have two more very small ones. Internasal means it's intermediate to the two nasal bones, is that suture that separates the two nasal bones right on the bridge of the nose. And then frontonasal separates the frontal bone from the nasal bones, and it's going to go right across the bridge of the nose right there. Some more of the openings. We've already talked about the mental foramen on the mandible. Others are the infraorbital foramen, infra meaning inferior, orbital is your eye socket, and foramen is hole. So this hole and that hole just below the eye socket or inferior to the eye socket are known as the infraorbital foramen. And these plastic skulls don't show them very well, but there should be another one right here on the brow ridge, and they're above the eye socket, so they would be the supraorbital. So they would be the supraorbital foramen. Okay, we come over here to the side. This hole in the side here for your ear canal is known as the external auditory meatus. And then underneath we have the big hole that is foramen magnum for your spinal cord going into your brainstem. And then again, these plastic ones don't show them very well, but this hole, which should be a little bigger, it's got a little pinhole in the middle of it. That one right there, that's just inside of this point, which we'll talk about in a minute, known as the styloid process. But that hole right there is the carotid foramens for your carotid artery. You have another one just like it over here, right in that area. And then this elongated hole that is just behind it is the jugular foramen. So right there is going to be the jugular, and here the jugular foramen. That's kind of hard to see, so I'll try to see if I can get it here and get it focused. So I'll use my pen cap as a pointer. So this hole and this hole would be the carotid foramen, and this elongated hole here, and then again here that pen cap is in, is the jugular foramen, and right in front of it right there is the carotid foramen. Okay. Next we have the processes. Okay, this is the mandibular fossa. This is the is that focused? This is the mandibular fossa for the mandible. Excuse me there. Mandible is going to fit right in there. So the mandible articulates with that depression. That's going to be the mandibular fossa. Underneath these pointy processes right here would be the styloid process of the skull. These larger, more massive processes are going to be the mastoid process. And then these smooth, remember condyles are smooth articular surfaces. These condyles would be known as the occipital condyles. And then this bump in the back is the occipital protuberance. And we've already talked about the zygomatic arch. Oh, and one of the bones I forgot is right here at the back of the roof of the mouth. It's right behind the maxilla, and it's the very posterior section of the roof of the mouth, and that is called the palatine bone. And I believe that is going to be all.